What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? How are you all doing tonight? And welcome to another episode of Faith Unaltered. I am just one of your three co-hosts for this evening. My name is Tyler Fowler, and as you can see, we have Colton Carlson back with us to continue our discussion of Calvinism, compatibilism, and all things determinism, I guess, in a sense, right? Theological determinism is the subject of tonight's discussion. And if you have not heard, I mean, this is like the eighth video in this kind of mini series that we've been having. We've got a whole entire playlist of every show that we did in chronological order over on our Faith Unaltered site. And so go check that out. If this is the first time joining in on this conversation, you are missing a lot. Stick around, hear us out. But if there's some things that maybe are a little confusing, go back, listen to those other 7 episodes, and I'm sure everything will be brought together. But first, before we dig into that, Joshua Davison, my brother, how are you doing tonight, sir?
I'm doing quite well. I do believe this is the 9th video.
9th, okay.
In that series. But yeah, this is going to be a fulfilling finality to a long series of discussions, and I am excited to have Colton back on. In the prayer beforehand, I thank God for his steady countenance and his good attitude and willingness to come on and discuss with us. And I'm just excited to have this happen again. So
Absolutely.
I feel privileged.
I know, right? Like I do as well. And you're right. It is our 9th because I remember talking to you about this, and we've got over 16 hours just dedicated to this subject alone. And I want you to tell our listeners, you had made a post whenever we had first put that playlist together and I released it. If you remember it, what was the comment that you had said posting it in different groups?
I don't remember exactly how I worded it, but it was something along the lines of our attempt at making the most extensive playlist to cover as many angles as possible about this one topic with qualified voices in civil discussions and trying to find clarity in a muddled mess of online opinions, and trying to come to a place where we had a resource that was usable, and friendly to the scholar and layman alike, making all of these ideas really just accessible. And you're right, like by that time we had, I think not counting the episode we're doing now, we have about 16 and a quarter hours of content, which is just uncanny.
Absolutely. And there is debate in there, right? Like the majority of the conversation that really happens around this discussion, or the type of conversation, I guess I could say, and what I've seen, and maybe you guys have experienced something different, but from what I've seen just on social media and even on YouTube, right, different videos, has been debate. There hasn't been a plethora, so to say, of people of the opposite sides coming together to hash these things out. They usually end into debate, and unfortunately, it sometimes ends in flustered debate. Not to say we don't have any debate. We've got the Tim Stratton and Chris Date debate that happened on Faith Unaltered a couple months back, and so I definitely encourage that kind of discussion. But I think what separates us from the majority of other people doing this, right, is that we, and Josh, I've really got this from you, is to present a style in which we offer not disputes, but questions, right? Clarifying questions on the subject. Because in my take, this is where the conversation doesn't even get off the ground if you don't define your terms in the very beginning. Like, I am a fan of that ideology, and I think it works, right? I really think it works, and I think our past shows have proved that beyond a shadow of a doubt. And so for you, my friend, I thank you for that wisdom, and I look forward to putting that in practice in other discussions. But Dell, brother, how are you doing? We had a fun episode last night talking about Sola Scriptura and the canon and all things fun with Jeremiah Nortier. Nortier, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. The apologetic dog. But, yeah. How you been since then, bro?
Yeah, that was a good show. I was interested to be in there and to hear what he had to say. I think I was kind of on his side for a lot of the stuff that he was sharing in terms of the nature of Scripture and how we decide things like the canon and everything. So yeah, that was a good show for sure.
Absolutely. So was there anything that you thought in that show that maybe you would have pushed back on, now kind of going back, re-listening to it, and hearing Jeremiah out? Or like you said, you're still in agreement with him throughout the majority of that. Is that right?
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to re-listen to it.
Okay.
So nothing off the top of my head. I would disagree with him. Yeah, I'm sure there's something, but like nothing off the top of my head.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
I would really like to hear him and Sherman talk about the canon. Just listening to Sherman and Matt, who Matt Hedges and Jeremiah seem to come from the same side whenever it comes to this discussion. I think they would present two really interesting cases, and I'd love to see them interact with each other. So Sherman, if you're listening, Jeremiah, if you're listening, think about that. I think that'd be really fun.
Matt had an interesting take.
Yep.
I agreed with a lot of what he said, but there were certain things I disagreed with him. Like, for example, he takes kind of like Edward F. Hill's thing. Like, he thinks the majority text or the Textus Receptus is the best or something like that,
Yeah.
rather than the critical text. So that was an interesting difference between him and Jeremiah there.
Right. And I'm more of a like critical text guy, but I haven't. That's why I was telling you guys before we went live, I want to dive into this subject a little deeper, because under the umbrella of the canon, right, there are still subtopics that one can really get into. Like, I've heard arguments for the Textus Receptus, and that passages like 1 John 5:7, the Trinitarian passage that's there, is actually original, whereas the critical text would say no, that was added in later. But I've actually heard arguments that no, that passage was original, it was later taken out. And so I want to dive into this subject a lot deeper, but until then, we have Colton Carlson back on with us. Colton, brother, how have you been since the last time you've been on? And are you working? I know you're back to school now. I know you teach. And so has there been anything new or exciting happen since you started your schooling back? And what's been up, bro? How you been?
I've been good.
Good.
Yeah, so I started early in January again, teaching. So this is my classroom behind me, mainly because I didn't want to be, my daughter was awake at my house, and she knows I would be in the office, and then all you would hear is her crying in the background. And I don't want that. So I love her, but I think it would disrupt what we're trying to do here. So that's why I'm here, and nothing new besides I'm doing chess coaching now. So
okay,
I'm the coach for chess. I say coach, but it's not like, it's just really, hey, don't move your rook there because it will be taken. So, I mean, maybe you try this opening instead.
Yeah.
It's really hard to coach chess, to be honest, but I'm the chess coach, and that's kind of new.
Okay.
But other than that, nothing new. I've just been reading a lot on theological determinism because that's what interests me the most. And I honestly do not see it. I told my wife, man, I really want to start because I'm an educator. So I really want to get into the philosophy of education, not just from a teacher's perspective, but from a philosopher's perspective, and actually read the relevant philosophers on how philosophy should be done, specifically after COVID in a post-pandemic world, how education mixes with philosophy, and how we should take our philosophy and ingrain it to our kids, and how we should educate them, blah, blah, blah. And she just looked at me and was laughed. I'm like, why? It's you're never going to give up free will. You're never going to give up free will. Who are you kidding? And I was like, huh.
So if I'm determined to do so, right?
I read a lot on free will, and it's been great. So that's kind of where I've been.
That's awesome, brother. And see, this is really, I know I haven't given a background for really what got this specific conversation started, but I think what you just said is a good leeway into that, right? And what we're going to be talking about tonight is I've got a list of questions for Colton. I originally, if I'm going to be 100% honest, I had these questions planned for Michael Preciado, because a lot of them have to deal with his book, A Reformed View of Freedom. And Michael couldn't come on the show, unfortunately. So I thought, who is the next best guy that I can think of? And Colton, you were that guy. We've had you on the show before. I've enjoyed our talks, and you were the one that actually recommended this book to me in a previous episode that we've done. And so I figured I would get you back on. I've sent you the questions kind of in advance. And I know I'm starting to lag maybe a little bit. I'm seeing on my computer where it's kind of my strength ain't as good. So if I cut out, Josh, if you would take over, that'd be awesome. Or Dale, whoever. But that's really what got this conversation started. And so I sent you these questions, and I really want to go through them because there were some things, in the book that I've still got questions on. And so I'm really excited. I will say this about the book before we do get started, though. And I was telling you guys this off air. Michael Preciado is one of the only guys that I know that have incorporated the analytical philosophy that goes into determinism and free will, and has taken that and kind of combined it into Reformed theology. And he even tells us in his book that hasn't really been done before. And I don't think it has. I really think that Michael is laying the groundwork for a lot more books to be written where they kind of do that same tactic and take the analytical philosophy, because as Preciado says, there is a mountain of gold in these books that Christians and theologians, I mean, it's just waiting for us to kind of plunder and take for the taking, right? And so I think he did a really, really good job in doing that. But before we get started, Josh, Dell, is there anything that you guys would like to add to the conversation, just as a preface before we kind of dive in?
I was going to say an important preface for me is chess is my anti-drug. So that's an awesome thing that you're doing there, and keep it up. I wish more people would teach young people how to think ahead and anticipate, make good strategies, and execute plans. It's really an invaluable tool. And I'm not joking. That game is incredible and a life lesson.
All right. And yeah, for me, I just want to say, number one, good evening, Ringo Cat. And also, here's a quick audience question for you, Colton. Someone's asking, what is your rating? Apparently, this is a chess question.
Yeah, so I had a rating a long time ago when I kind of competed a bit on chess.com. It was about like maybe 6 years ago, when some of my other students, I wasn't coaching then, but some of my other students were interested. So I was like, I thought, try it out. I wasn't familiar with chess.com. Got a rating. At that time, it was around like 1,200. Not like good by any stretch of the imagination, but not terrible. Like, I can make a plan and I can try to execute it, like Josh is saying. And do I make some mistakes? Yeah, but by and large, I can checkmate somebody. I don't know what it is now. I would like to say I'm better, but I haven't been on chess.com for a while, and so now I just play with my students, and so I don't know if it's changed. So
Gotcha. Better than me, that's for sure. I'll say that.
Right on. And Josh, I just wanted to ask too, real quick. Isn't there another friend of ours that really is into chess? Ain't it Chase?
Chase is really, really into chess right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So
he's actually been doing a lot of online AI chess work and watching and learning a lot of tutorial videos and things like that for opening and middle game. And he's been posting about it pretty regularly on his Facebook about his progress. And so, yeah, he's really into it right now for sure.
Yeah, Chase Orozco. So shout out to you, brother. And we've actually had him on CSG, and you've had him on CSG to discuss his book. He writes a fantasy book. What's that book called again?
Masters of Eldrion.
Yeah. So
and that book, I have still neglected to buy a hard copy. My apologies, Chase. I repent, and I will rectify that soon. But he also came on to talk about storytelling and metaphysics and meaning. I think it was like 3-4 weeks later, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that conversation was fantastic. I really liked that. We covered a lot of different topics, from authorship to emotive presence to the difference between showing and telling. And then we even talked about AI for a minute there, and these AI generated stories and things like that, and how that's going to impact human intuition in the future and stuff. It was a really great conversation. I felt it was very cutting edge. So everybody should check that out too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, y'all, Faith Unaltered, we're less than 50 people away from our 1,000 subscriber milestone. So I'm encouraging everyone, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. Leave us a like if you like this content. Give us a thumbs up and help us get this content out to more and more people. We're so close. We're so close to 1,000 subs.
40 left.
We're 40 left. I never thought we'd get that far, but we have, and it keeps growing. And so I'm
in
really
less than a
excited.
year too. I have to say that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know whenever we started, David had 400, at least 400. It was climbing to 5. It wasn't quite there yet. And then since we started Faith Unaltered back in July, we've doubled that. And so that's just fantastic. But all right, let's jump in, Colton. So my first question is, so again, I've given the preface. This is from the book. And so a lot of these questions for our listeners are going to start out on page so-and-so of Preciato's book. Da, 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 right? And so just to kind of give a disclaimer, I guess, to our listeners, that's the way that this formatted is. Granted, we're going to have open dialogue. I'm sure that's the way these conversations always go with Colton, and I love it. And so let us begin, shall we? So the first question I've got, Colton, on footnote 57 of chapter 1, the following is written, quote, Fisher and Revisa's point is that actions done from genuinely irresistible urges are not reasons responsive, and this is why we have the intuition that an agent that acts from a genuinely irresistible urge is not morally responsible. And I just want to pause for a second for our listeners. If you are having a hard time following already, go back, listen to the previous episodes. I promise this will all make sense, but I really don't want to take the time to rehash out all these different concepts because we've done that in a show already, and it took the majority of the show to do that. But my question, Colton, is does this have any impact on the doctrine of irresistible grace? If so, why? And if not, why not?
Right. Great question. And so when I first read Fisher and Revisa's book, their 1998 book, Responsibility and Control, and I saw they were throwing out this irresistible urge, like phrase every so often in their explication of their theory of moral responsibility, it was really odd for me as a Calvinist who holds to irresistible grace. I was like, instinctively and intuitively, we're like, wait, they don't think irresistible urges are compatible with moral responsibility. It actually precludes moral responsibility. So how does that relate to the irresistible grace? It's actually pretty, once you actually study the Reformed theology a bit, it's the answer is actually pretty simple.
Okay.
The word irresistible is just used by the Synods of Dort, like the Reformed theologians, probably for lack of a better word. I don't think that they really mean the same irresistible that Fish and Revisa mean when they say irresistible. What Fish and Revisa mean by irresistible is something that bypasses the agent's will. So like, for instance, if I'm, to my wife, I'm grabbing her hand and I'm just kind of shoving in her face, stop hitting yourself. And it's silly and childish, but it's a really good example because that is almost like she has this irresistible urge. You would think that her hand's hitting herself, but it's not through her. It's something that she can't help. Or someone who has Tourette's syndrome is also another kind of, or someone who has like a pathological fear of something, like for blood or of spiders. They almost can't help that. And they get mad when people bring it up because, or someone has ADHD. These are irresistible urges.
Josh is your poster boy, bro.
I'm just like calling him out all over.
Yeah.
So, but these are irresistible urges that Fish and Revisa think preclude moral responsibility. And I'm inclined to agree with them. But then what's the difference between that and irresistible grace? Irresistible grace, I would like to change the word to just efficacious grace. So with regards to the efficacious grace, that means, and this is nothing new, it's in the Reformed theology or theological tradition. This word allows for God's grace to be efficacious in the believer, not to push or compel or force via bypassing the agent's will in order for the agent to be saved or be in the kingdom. And so when we think about this idea of irresistible urge, in short, Fisher and Revisa, through context, if you read their whole book and their theory, what they mean is a bypassing of the will, something that circumvents the agent's own agency, that doesn't operate in a mechanism that's pertinent to their moral responsibility. But with regards to irresistible grace, Calvinism, the theological tradition, irresistible grace is mainly just to be a term used for efficaciousness, or something that's producing in the will of the agent that is desirable, but yet not compelled or forced or coerced in a way. Okay. So I hope that makes sense, the differences between the two. I agree, the intuition, the question that you had was like, right, I had the same question.
You're right.
So then you have to kind of understand, because Fisher and Revisa don't come at this from a biblical perspective, right? So that's why. And so if you're like thinking, wait, like, how could they use that? They're not Christians. So right. Fisher and Revisa are not Christians. Preciado is. He's right now in this chapter just exposing their view, expositing it, showing what their view entails. And so, of course, he's going to quote them, and of course, he's going to be using their same language. And so he uses the language irresistible urge, but that shouldn't be synonymous with irresistible grace.
Yeah, I mean, on a surface level, there really is that initial, wait a minute, like what you just said, and I think people reading that, if they got Preciado's book, would have the same effect, right? If both of us did, like, why wouldn't they, right? And so my question then, just kind of hearing you out, would it make sense to say, because there's a difference, right, between manipulation cases, right, for example, whereas whenever it comes to irresistible grace, from what I understand, and Colton, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's not like necessarily that God bypasses the will in a sense, but would it be proper to say that he actually changes our will? As I've heard James White say multiple times, he takes out that heart of stone, puts in that heart of flesh, and in turn, we come running to God. Is that fair to say?
We have to be careful. As a philosopher, I'm going to say, of course, it depends. I think we have to be careful what we mean by change. Okay. But generally, yes, I would say it's fair to say that God changes our heart of stone and makes it into a heart of flesh. That's the regenerative process, so that our heart of flesh can actually respond to divine stimuli, namely the Spirit. And so then he works in our heart to change us. So I am hesitant, but at the same time, I'm like, yeah, I think that's fine. I mean, God does change the will.
Can I take a stab at rephrasing the question, I guess? Is the difference then something like inducing a new desire in the will versus bypassing the will, or obviously opposing the will?
Good question. I don't know, given Reformed theology, if it would be fair to say that God induces a new desire in the will, because it depends on what you mean by induce.
As in input new information to bring up. This is something that we talked about with Chris Date in our Reformed theology episode. Was the only direct interventions that he was talking about that are relevant to something like, because his author analogy is that God writes himself into the story, so to speak, and those direct interventions are very seldom, and this would be an instance of his direct intervention to input new information, let's say, where the non-believer has a certain frame of reference, has a certain experience, has a will that's pointing them in this direction via their desires and so forth, and then he inputs new information to alter the desires and therefore the course of their decision making by altering their will specifically. In other words, giving them a new nature is another way of saying the same thing, I suppose. But I'm trying to use language that people are already familiar with. You know what I mean? Is that the desire that you have is going to be before the decision made, and the decision made is to follow Christ. In order to do so, granted, total depravity and so forth, God has to change your nature and overcome that inability by giving you granting you the grace, so to speak, to believe. And that would be what I would say is inducing a new desire in the will. That's what I mean by that.
Yeah, so I agree with everything. I would still be hesitant on the idea of inducement. Only because the word induce, I think, has certain negative connotations, especially with regards to the free will debate. So like some like manipulative connotations to it. And I want to try to refrain. I'm not saying that's bad. I want to try to refrain from that aspect, only because I don't believe given irresistible grace or efficacious grace in the Reformed theological tradition, that regeneration necessarily entails a manipulation of some type. So I agree with you that yes, let's just for the sake of argument say our wills have to be changed. How our wills are changed, I think, is the more important question.
I would say I mean, is there a better word to use? Like, let's say John 6:44 says the word draw has the implication of dragging. Is that a better implication to use than to say that he induces a new desire in your will? I'm trying to phrase this in a way that it makes more sense, I guess.
I would be okay with draw, obviously, because it's biblical. I don't like how certain Reformed theologians take it literally to mean like dragging against your wills. And then, or like one Reformed theologian or one Reformed pastor one time at a college, he said, God literally kidnapped me in his kingdom. At the time, I was like, oh, that's cool. But then I was like, when you become more astute in your journey of reading and looking at the Reformed tradition and the free will debate, I'm like, I get what he's trying to say, right? But does he actually mean that? I don't know. So all that to say is, do I actually mean that God drags us like against our will? No, I think it is through our wills. And I think it's through a compatibilist means, of course, but I would be better by using the word draw. Right.
Okay. Fair enough.
Not like a seduction type draw either. Because I know some non-Calvinists have pointed this like, oh, so you think God seduces you, draws you in that case. And I'm like, whoa, okay. No. But I need to also say that I don't think God seduces us in the sense that it almost deceives us to become part of his kingdom and regenerates us in that sense. I don't believe that. And so that is,
so if we were to translate
that, but
if we were to translate the word draw and the implication that it has of kind of like drawing in a net, dragging in fish, like what's a better, like a more modern, like how would we translate this to somebody in modern language to get away from our Christianese, let's say?
How? I think it's Matthew 13:44. I would use that. So Matthew, I think 13:44, if I remember correctly, is the pearl in the field or something along those lines, where he sees this great pearl in the field. He sells all that he has to buy that field. He sees the beauty of that field. And so I think that that's exactly what's happening to the sinner in conversion underneath Reformed theology. He sees the beauty of God, and he is just compelled in this sense through his will, not forcefulness, not coerced, not manipulated, not deceived through seduction or dragged, but rather he's irresistibly or efficaciously compelled to want to do that thing. So for Matthew 13:44, the parable, to sell all that he has, and he did it through his own accord, yet he did it and it was efficacious because he saw the beauty of this thing. I think God is the same way. So when the sinner sees just how beautiful God is, when God does enlighten his heart, I think that's Ephesians 1:18, when God enlightens his heart and opens his eyes to that perspective, the sinner's like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. I can't not have this. And then they're efficaciously drawn.
Okay, so it would be like effectively compelled, right? Like, but you're saying this also is in reference to like an internal kind of like
Right.
experience of that desire, that drive. It's not like, again, it's not the metaphysical handcuffs, right? This is something where the person is now actively desiring to do so, and that's why, therefore, it's not against their will. I'm still following, right?
Right.
Okay.
And another good model, and we don't need to get into it, but would be Fisher and Revisa's actual Frankfurt style cases. In the actual sequence, Jones is not compelled in the sense of forcefulness. He's not coerced. He doesn't have metaphysical handcuffs or anything like that. But could he do otherwise? And of course, Fisher and Revisa at least say, well, no, he can't. And so that at least jives the intuition. Well, he did it on his own. So if he did it on his own, he's not, in their words, have an irresistible urge, meaning forcefulness, but he did it on his own because he wanted to do what he did on his own. And it's very, very similar, I think, although there's some pieces that I would change, to the Reformed theological tradition. Very similar. In the actual sequence of events, we see the beauty of God's goodness, and through God's kindness, it leads us to repentance. It efficaciously draws us to him because he is beautiful, and I would say objectively beautiful. So I'm not sure if that answers any of your questions or concerns, but yeah, that's what I would say.
It sounds like
I think that effectively compelled is probably better than inducing a new desire, perhaps, or is more favorable to what you're trying to explain. So I think I understand. I think you answered well enough. Yeah.
It sounds like there's multiple steps. Like this isn't just a cut and dry black and white thing, right? There are multiple steps that God actually takes to what's the word I'm looking for? Not succeed in this, but to lead the person to Christ effectively, right? And
effectively compel.
Effectively compelled, exactly. Jordan actually has a really interesting question that I think is goes right along with what we're talking about. But wouldn't this entail universalism? Why wouldn't universalism be true given irresistible or efficacious grace?
Because he doesn't save everybody. So he doesn't. I would say that if God were to reveal himself to every single person, then yeah, it would entail universalism based on the Calvinistic tradition. But the Calvinistic Reformed tradition says that he does not, and that universalism is false.
Yeah.
And then he has whatever reason, whatever theodicy or defense that the Calvinist wants to put in place of why God doesn't reveal himself to everybody is a different question. But
have you ever
he just reveal himself to everybody. So
out of curiosity, have we ever asked you, like, what do you have any notion as to what that reason might be, or is it just a mystery? Or
yeah, so I think it's if I remember, Christopher Green has a fantastic essay in the book Calvinism and the Problem of Evil, edited by Johnson and Alexander. And basically, he gives a demonstrative goods defense. So defense is not a theodicy, right? So, of course, I think you guys know that. But defense is, this could be the reasons, but it may not.
Right.
So it's more divested instead of invested. And he gives, I think, close to 13 goods for why God wouldn't just save everybody. And so I will let the reader or the listener or whatever to just go and read that for himself. I think some of them are really, really good, the goods that he lists. I think others are worse. But I think generally that is the idea. The idea really is just it's people are saved or not saved in order to demonstrate either from God's goodness or God's justice, or to demonstrate something good in the person who is saved. Something along those lines. I haven't read it in a while, but I would just leave it at that. I think those would be good reasons, or soul building could be another good reason, or God's divine glory defense could be another good reason. So I think the Calvinist has many resources to pull from here.
Yeah, I think, what'd you say, Colton? There was 13 different reasons that
I
he
think,
lists?
I think if I remember correctly, I
Okay.
don't remember, but
Yeah.
I think it was 13. He gives out 13, and he defends them. He just doesn't list them out and be like, okay, done.
All right, done. Yeah.
He actually defends them and why he thinks they're biblical, and why they're compatible with the Reformed tradition, and then also why he thinks others are good and others are not so good. But
And what's the
and he
name of
relates
that?
it to other theodicies too, which is really good.
Right on. What's the name of that book again? I'll post it in the link.
Calvinism and the Problem of Evil. I think it was published in 2016. You can just Google it, Amazon it, and it should pop up. And Christopher Green, I think, was the one who said, okay, the demonstrative goods defense is what the article is called.
Okay. Right on. Yeah, it almost, let's see, Calvinism and the Problem of Evil, Alexander David E. Johnson and Daniel I'll look for it here in a little bit and then post it in the description whenever I find it. Christopher Green. Okay. But it almost, I'm just thinking of Jordan's question, and you guys can correct me, and Jordan, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but given, what Colton just said, it almost sounds like you're taking the concept of prevenient grace and adding this efficacious element to it. And since God instills prevenient grace to everyone, right? I think that's what would be the Arminian or non-Calvinist argument, that God gives everyone prevenient grace. If you added that efficacious element into it, right, then all would be saved in that sense. Is that kind of what I'm hearing, or Colton, what do you think about that?
Yes. So I've written a little bit about why I disagree with prevenient grace in my volume 1 reply to Stratton. Although of course it's against Stratton and not against any specific non-Calvinist, but even if prevenient grace was true, the Calvinists could just say that's common grace, but that doesn't mean he needs to efficaciously or effectively save the sinner. And I'm using effectively with the A, so effectively not with the E, because
effectively
is different than efficacious.
Right.
So I would just say efficaciously, God could save all. He just doesn't. And for whatever reasons that is a different question.
Okay.
So it's kind of the same, but I would just say, like, no Calvinist is going to hold to prevenient grace. No Calvinist rooted in the Reformed tradition is going to hold to prevenient grace. Let me say that.
Right. I actually, I know you guys know David Lewis. And I don't know if he's still doing the podcast or not. Apologetics in the Attic. He actually makes a really good defense on our argument against prevenient grace that I found very compelling. So if you guys want to check out his work, Apologetics in the Attic is his Facebook and YouTube channel for sure. Maybe Facebook. But all right, guys, let's move on. Before I ask the second question, there is one question here in the comments, Colton, and you'll see why if you're not looking at it already, from Chris Anthony. If you don't want to answer it, like, I get it, okay? Why is God so angry with people who he doesn't efficaciously call, even if he knows that they can't believe without him?
I'll answer it, but it's an easy answer. It's a preloaded question, so you can't start with your conclusion embedded in the question that God is angry. Well, that requires an argument.
Mm-hmm.
So why is God angry? Calvinist doesn't say that, but he does. What the Calvinist does say is that he is full of justice, and he does have wrath towards sinners. And so if you're going to follow in the Edwardian tradition, then yeah, God does have wrath towards sinners. However strong that wrath is a different question, but he just doesn't efficaciously call all sinners, for a variety of reasons. And I've already said what some of those reasons might be. And I've already given the listener a great resource from professionals, not me, but from professionals who lay it out even more in detail. So I think that is sufficient. So if Chris is angry with my comment here, then he can go read that.
Right on, right on. All right, guys. Anything else before we move on to the next question? Josh, Dale, you guys good? Okay. All right. In chapter 2, under the section entitled "The Moral," and one thing, real quick. So I really, honestly, with my whole heart, tried to get page numbers. I would have had to order the actual hard copy of the book in order to get the page numbers, and I didn't do that. So I guess I could have done that. But all of my quotes are coming from Logos. And the thing about Logos, like, don't get me wrong, I love Logos to death. If they were to sponsor this channel, I would promote them every single episode. Hint, hint, Logos. But here's the thing. In some books, whenever they give the chapters that it's under. If you go up there to the search engine, you will see the chapter instead of the page number. And some books have the page number. And so, like I said, without ordering that hard copy, this was one of those books where it just had the chapter up there. And so I tried to give as much detail for our listeners as I could, so where they could go in the book to find these quotes, including the chapter. And Michael Preciado does a really good job of kind of subheading all of his sections in the book. And so that's what you get with this, is the chapter and the subheading that's found under the section.
I have the book with me.
Do you?
And this particular quote that you're about to read is from page 42 to 43.
Awesome. Thank you so much, dude. I love you for that. Thank you. All right. And so in chapter 2, under the section entitled "The Moral Education of a Child," Preciado writes the following, and this is kind of lengthy, so bear with me. Quote, "We have seen that the moral education of a child consists of two things. First, viewing himself as the source of his actions, and second, viewing himself as the apt target of the reactive attitudes. Fisher and Revisa are appealing to a subjective experience in the child. We may think that the child is objectively responsible, but it is important that the child also view himself as responsible. This is a subjective experience that every responsible agent must have to be held morally responsible. Without viewing oneself both as the source and as an apt target of the reactive attitudes, the person diminishes in responsibility or is not responsible," end quote. But then a few paragraphs later, Preciado writes, quote, "It is important to understand that when Fisher and Revisa appeal to the agent as the source of his behavior, they do not mean that he is the ultimate source, nor do they mean that nothing has caused or determined his actions. Instead, they mean that his actions spring from a mechanism that is moderately reasons responsive, and that the agent has taken ownership of his mechanism. Part of taking ownership is subjectively seeing or accepting that he caused the action that affects the world in certain ways. He truly believes that he is the causal source. And as we will see later, this requires more than simply uttering the words, 'I am the causal source.' Instead, it requires the belief that I am the causal source," end quote. So my question, Colton, and let me pull this up real quick. If God is the ultimate source of our desires, thoughts, and actions, how at the same time can we appropriately view ourselves as the source of our desires, of our thoughts, and our actions? At that point, wouldn't it be an illusion, or merely seem to be, that we are the source? And doesn't the language of source imply one?
Right. Good question. So the idea of sourcehood is kind of sticky in today's literature, and I wish that there's more talk on different kinds of sourcehood.
Mhm.
But in my reply to Stratton Volume 1, I try to do just that underneath the section Frankfurt style examples.
Mhm.
And what Fisher and Revisa are actually talking about here is not, as Preciado said already, the ultimate source. They do not mean to say that the child has, or the agent in question, of whether or not they are morally responsible. They don't need to see themselves as the ultimate source in order to be morally responsible. I don't like Preciado's phrasing here to say I am the causal source. I will straight up say that. Like, I love the guy. He's a good friend of mine, but I'm not going to be okay with saying I am the causal source, because I think it's ambiguous. I would much rather say I am a causal source. And so that allows for, instead of the indefinite article, or instead of the definite article, we can replace it with an indefinite article. And that allows us to say, okay, there's multiple ideas of sourcehood here. So with regard to libertarianism or the incompatibilists, they're going to hold to the efficient or the ultimate source in the terms of Robert Kane, who's a libertarian. So he's going to say, yeah, in order to be morally responsible, I have to be the ultimate source. So underneath Calvinist determinism, theological divine determinism, what does that mean? Your question is, if God is the ultimate source of our thoughts and actions, how at the same time can we appropriately view ourselves? Well, because we don't view ourselves as the ultimate source. I don't need to be considered as the ultimate source in order to be morally responsible, just a source. Okay, so I think there's two different sources kind of at balance here. Is God the sufficient source underneath Calvinist determinism? Yeah. Is he the efficient source of all things? No, he's not the efficient source of sin, as we're going to get to in a bit, but he is the efficient source of other things like righteousness. But he is still the sufficient source of all things, which is just to say he is the ultimate source of all things. Just need to clarify the efficiency and deficiency, all those kinds of ways one could determine something or be the source of something. With regards to humans, we are, I would say, the formal source, to take Aristotelian language here. So we are the formal source or the instrumental source of this thing. Again, what Fisher and Reviezer are trying to do is build a theory of moral responsibility, basically from the groundwork, although it's not exactly needed, but they use it to help build their theory, the groundwork of a Frankfurt-style case. So in a Frankfurt-style case, does Jones do what he does in the actual sequence on his own? And we would have the intuition, yeah, he does what he does because he's not forced, compelled, manipulated, or anything. Right. That is the alternative sequence in which the counterfactual intervener, Black, actually does intervene. But that's not the sequence we're talking about. We're talking about this actual sequence. So in the actual sequence, they would say, Fisher and Reviezer would say that Jones is a source. Why? Because he does it on his own. Okay. Now, because he does it on his own, does that necessarily mean he has the ability to do otherwise? Well, some philosophers say yes, like Kevin Tempe, but he's an incompatibilist. And then other philosophers would say absolutely not, because it depends on how strong you make the Frankfurt-style case. So like Carolina Sartario, who's a compatibilist, would say, no, I disagree with you, Tempe, and here's why, blah, 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 blah. But the idea is there's two different kinds of sources. And so, yes, God is a sufficient source given theological determinism, and that includes our desires, thoughts, and actions. But that does not necessitate the preclusion of me being a source, like the formal source. So we are a source. And so the language of source doesn't necessitate there be only one source. It just necessitates that something has to control something else. And I'll give an example and then I'll stop talking. I think it's really, really great to see. I'll actually give two. So one example is this. Let's just say we do live in a causally deterministic world where the laws of nature determine everything else. If lightning struck Billy Bob at time t, okay, would we say that the laws of nature struck Billy Bob? Kind of intuitive that we would say, no, the lightning struck Billy Bob.
Right.
But the lightning was just an instrumental source of the actual efficient source being the laws of nature. Another example would, and so intuitively we want to say that the lightning was still a source, even though it wasn't the sufficient source. And another example would be Harry Potter. I love this example because it kind of, again, is intuitive to me. And I think other people would share this intuition. Did Harry Potter kill Voldemort? And of course, I think the intuition is, well, yeah, for sure. Yeah, of course. But he wasn't the sufficient source of killing Voldemort. Of course, if we take it into a deterministic lens, who killed Voldemort? Well, Rowling did, right? J.K. Rowling. She killed Voldemort, but through Harry Potter. So when I ask the question, the very first thing that comes to your mind is Harry Potter, not Rowling. So then when we put it into a deterministic universe, when you say who did what, even if I know everything's determined, or you know everything's determined, or we're questioning whether or not everything is determined.
Right.
The idea is when you say, well, did you really do that? Are you the source? Well, I think the same intuition should be brought to a deterministic universe from the lightning struck Billy Bob and also through Harry Potter. We can say that I am a source of what I do. Am I the sufficient source? No, but I am a source, and I think that is necessary, or sorry, that is sufficient for moral responsibility. And Fisher and Revisa here think so too. So I hope that kind of clarifies the question a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had talked about this, and I love the analogies. And like I said, we talked about this on a previous episode. And I think, if I'm remembering, I know I used this analogy, so the biblical story about David and Uriah, right? And so I want to ask you, because I don't think I asked you this last time. I might have, and if I did, feel free to answer it anyway, just for our listeners that haven't. But let me know. But okay, so given the story of David and Uriah, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Colton, but did you say a minute ago that God isn't the source of sin or sinful actions, or how would you phrase, or how would you word that?
Yeah, so I don't think God is the efficient source of sinful
Okay.
actions. So the idea behind Aristotle's four causes is the efficient source is like bringing something from rest to unrest, or
Okay.
basically contradicting from this state to another state. So state A to not state A. So I think because God's omnibenevolence, God can only determine something efficiently via righteousness. So like
Okay.
he can only determine righteousness in this efficient sort of manner. Okay. He cannot determine sin in that manner, because then he would, to me, be the author of sin. Because then he would actually be doing that thing. But let's just say for miracles and for the resurrection of the dead, actual conversion in individuals, all those are good things and are from God. And I would say efficaciously from God. So he does do those things, and he is the efficient determiner of those things because those are good and righteous things.
Okay.
But when it comes to me sinning, he doesn't efficiently determine me to sin.
Okay. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to lump everything, so the thoughts, the action that took place, into this bubble, so to say, of David's sinful action to kill Uriah, right? That what you're saying is God did not efficiently determine David to kill Uriah. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay. In what sense then, since all things come from God, right? God determines this in some way, right? It's just not efficient. In what way does God determine David to kill Uriah in this sense, since that is what came to pass?
So this has to do with this idea of passive or active decrees.
Okay.
And it's not new to me. It's in the Reformed tradition. In fact, Preciado does, and we'll probably get to it later or right away if you want to, but he does actually bring it up in the book, and he talks about deficient causation or deficient determination and efficient determination. And what does it mean to determine something efficiently and deficiently? So God, with regards to your example with Uriah, David kills Uriah because he is actually sinful and God is not. God does not determine David to kill Uriah efficiently, but through a deficient means. And what that means is that he refrains his grace from the situation. So he takes his grace out of the situation. And whenever God refrains his grace from a situation, the only thing that could come about is something that's not righteousness. So sin, because God is necessarily righteous. So his hand, wherever his hand is a righteous thing or a righteous object, a righteous situation, a righteous event, like I said, the resurrection of Christ. But when he refrains his presence, and by presence I mean his hand, his involvement in that, what happens is is that the thing that will necessitate out of that omission, divine omission,
Yeah.
is sin.
Okay.
Okay,
So it's
so
not like, so just stop you, just to clarify real quick. So it's not like God is permitting or allowing. He's active in this, right? He's active by actively taking out his or restraining the sin, right? I think that James White uses that in a couple of debates, actually. So instead of God restraining sin, he actively chooses to withdraw his hand, which therefore brings about the sinful actions of David. Is that fair to say?
I don't like the word active here.
Okay.
And actually, a lot of philosophers doing work on omission,
Hmm.
they, I want to be cautious because I haven't studied it to the best of my ability here. But how I understand it, and Randolph Clark has a great book on omission, and
Yeah.
it tends to agree with what I'm saying, is that you can't have an active omission. It is passive in its very nature or intrinsic nature of it. So while you can, though, have sufficiency in omissions. So I think God is still the sufficient determiner
Hmm.
of the idea of David killing Uriah. That remains the same. And then, of course, the Calvinists would have to show that even though God is the sufficient determiner of sin, how that doesn't entail the author of evil charge. But that's a separate question. But I would still say that God is the sufficient determiner of sin. He's just not the efficient determiner of sin.
Okay.
And so he is, by not being the efficient determiner of sin, he is the passive determiner of sin, or
Okay.
the deficient cause of that sin. And so I don't like using the word active. What I would rather say is he's the passive determiner of that sin. And I think that when you said before, when we try to lay out all of our definitions, we get so much more work done in theological and philosophical debates. And I agree. But this, again, is nothing new to me. It's actually found in the Reformed traditions like hundreds of years ago.
Hmm.
And so when we have incompatibilists like Stratton himself, or other incompatibilists I've talked to, or theologians like Roger Olson or something, when they try to argue against like theological determinism, they kind of, I think, miss the mark, because the idea is they think that it's like a chess match, that God is literally actively moving the pieces instead of determining the pieces through what he does not do.
Mm.
And as a good chess player would know, you get checkmate by not just actively moving the pieces, but by actively not moving other pieces.
Hmm.
Right. So the idea is that. So do I still achieve my result by omission or by action? And the idea is yes. And God can determine through his omission of grace or his action of grace in any given event. And I
Okay.
think that still renders the conclusion that he is the sufficient determiner of all things,
Hmm.
but it just depends on what event. Is he the efficient determiner of this, or deficient determiner of that? And so I don't like using active in omissions. I'd much rather use passive. And I think
Okay.
it's much more intuitive to see it that way.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I'm glad you broke that down for me. Appreciate it. Josh, I know you have something.
Dale can go ahead. That's cool.
Okay.
I just so I've been trying to get in for a while now, and
Wait your turn, sir. No, I'm just kidding.
I just wanted to raise a quick potential challenge to the two analogies that you gave. So in terms of the lightning, you were saying like, well, there's the laws of nature, and then there's the lightning that strikes, but there are different interpretations of what the laws of nature are. That I don't think there are anything that are the laws of nature. They're just mathematical descriptions of the causal dispositions that the lightning has, or the clouds, or whatever it is. So
Right.
in that case, there would only be that one source. It's the lightning. With Harry Potter, this was an objection we kind of got last time. They would say like, well, look, we're actually, Harry Potter's just a fictional character, and because of that, we're operating under the delusion as though he is real, and we're treating him as an agent. But that's relying upon a delusion, a falsehood, rather than for being truthful, it really is J.K. Rowling who no one was killed in the first place. So like, yeah, I just wanted to like raise those challenges to those analogies. Yeah, what do you think of that?
Actually,
So-
before you answer, if I could add one more thing to what he just said, because I was actually going to say something about that earlier, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow because you were explaining something that was really important very clearly, and I didn't want to interject because I didn't want to like derail the train. But because Harry Potter is fictional and we are in fact actual, and moral responsibility is not merely a plot device to God's authorship of reality. Harry Potter's just as morally responsible as some other kind of non-agency mechanism. Like if, let's say, a heat-seeking missile, you can say it wants to follow and attach to heat signatures and have the mechanism to ensure that that want is actually met. But we would literally never consider a missile to be morally responsible, even though it's pursuing something internally because of a mechanism that was placed in it, right? And even if we could implant an artificial intelligence into a missile to grant it some semblance of conscious experience, so much so that it views itself as a source or the source, it still would not be an agent, and it wouldn't be an actual source in the sense that we're using the word source in this episode right now. And so I think that this goes right back to Tyler's question earlier, is this idea of the viewing yourself as the source or a source seems wholly subjective, and at best a misapprehension of reality, but a kind of convenience for the theory. And so I think that what Dale is saying about the idea that it's not real, nobody actually died, you can in fact trace it back to J.K. Rowling, right? But in terms of our reality and things that are actually happening around us, including the story of David and Uriah, those things actually did occur. And so I think the analogy begins to break down at the exact relevant point that God being the author would make, like, how would we say that David's desire to kill Uriah came about except by way of that determinism, that preemptive determinism, and all of those antecedent factors? They're all involved, and none of them are not God's doing.
All right, so a couple things. Back to the missile, has nothing to do with whether or not the missile is morally responsible. And even if we did want to say that, the missile wouldn't meet all the conditions of Fisher-Revise's moral responsibility. So it wouldn't meet guidance control because it's not like moderate reasons. It's not moderate reasons responsiveness. It doesn't have a subjective component and blah, blah, blah. All I tried to show in the analogy was that there's one relevant similarity. And so when you're pointing out, both Dale and Josh are pointing out, what they're pointing out is relevant differences. Well, of course, there's going to be tons of relevant differences. So you can press an analogy based on, okay, there is no relevant difference, and then give the analogy. All right, and then you would say, well, here's a relevant difference, and then it would defeat the analogy. Or the person who's pressing the analogy can say there is one relevant similarity. Not that there's no relevant difference, but there's one relevant similarity. That's a weaker argument, which is harder to refute. All I'm saying is that there's one relevant similarity, that there is such a thing as a instrumental source. That is it. Nothing with regards to the missile being responsible. Of course, the missile is not responsible. But can we still say what killed the village? What blew up the village? Well, instinctively, I would say that, well, the missile blew up the village. Right. But what was the sufficient cause of blowing up the village? Well, the pilot who actually, okay, so the idea is that still the missile did something. We still want to say that the missile exploded and blew up the village. That is the instrumental source. And then the actual sufficient source was the pilot who actually let the missile go. That's all I'm claiming. Same thing with the deterministic laws, understanding the dialectical context and the analogy that I'm putting it in is vital. So yeah, the deterministic laws, the laws don't need to be construed that way. You're right, Dale. But based on the fact that you have to assume so I'm defending a source, a instrumental source that is compatible with theological determinism. So that means given the idea of theological determinism or causal determinism or nominological determinism, whatever determinism you want, given that idea, meaning it's assumed at the front, is there such a thing as a coherent source? So that's why I use the idea of the laws of nature determining that lightning bolt hitting Billy Bob. So it's assumed or presumed that given this scenario, is there such a thing as a source that is compatible with determinism? Well, yes. Let's take then, for instance, a deterministic scenario, namely the causal determinism, the lightning being causally determined by the laws of nature. Okay, what killed Billy Bob? And of course, yes, the sufficient cause of Billy Bob's death is the laws of nature. However, you can, whatever determinism suits your fancy here. I'm just using the laws of nature because it's the most common causal deterministic apprehension of determinism. So I'm just saying, yeah, the laws of nature is a sufficient cause. But wait, is there any other more cause that we can say? And I think intuitively, yes. The lightning did cause the death of Billy Bob, intuitively. That's what we want to say. Now, is it the only cause? No. Right. So the laws of nature is the sufficient cause, but the instrumental cause, the formal cause in Aristotelian language is the lightning. And then finally, with Harry Potter, I would say that yes, still, Harry Potter is the instrumental cause of Voldemort. Now, again, think about the dialectical context. When everyone wants to say, is for the author analogy, the very first thing that everyone wants to say is, well, Harry Potter's not real. So, but what you're doing is misunderstanding the dialectical context in which I'm putting the analogy. I'm arguing an analogy in one relevant similarity. Of course, Harry Potter's not real. Aside from the fact that maybe idealism is true, and then maybe we're all imaginary friends in God's mind. Let's put that off to the side. But because some people actually do think that, right?
Divine solipsism, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, side note, I did have a student try to argue that in my philosophy class a couple years back, and it was hilarious. Everyone made fun of him. But it was that analogy that I'm pressing here is the one relevant similarity, namely the sourcehoodness. Of course, there's tons of relevant differences that you could be pressing. And if I did press the analogy such that I said, hey, Harry Potter, divine determinism, no relevant difference, then that would be, in my estimation, a valid critique. Because then what is the relevant difference? Well, we're real and he's not. So booyah, right? But I'm not pressing the analogy in that way. I'm pressing it in a rather weaker way. One that's a little bit harder to refute, a little bit more honed in to what I'm trying to prove. And that's the case that there is one relevant similarity between Harry Potter and us, that Harry Potter can be seen as a source, an instrumental source. And I, given, regardless of whether or not the author analogy is actually true, okay, I can be considered as a source. And that sourcehoodness is compatible with all things being sufficiently determined by antecedent factors beyond my regulative control. So intuitively, we want to say in just normal conversation, I say, hey, Dale, you catch the latest reading of Harry Potter's Deathly Hallows? Man, can you believe it? Who killed Voldemort? And he's like, yeah, Harry Potter, that buffoon. Or if you were more of like Voldemort's side, or you're like, yeah, Harry Potter, you killed him. Thank God, like he was such an evil villain. What are you saying? Intuitively, you're saying that Harry Potter is a source. And so that's a really weak claim I'm trying to say. But I think that gets the point across that there are sourcehoods that are compatible with something being determined and with compatible with having no alternative possibilities whatsoever.
Gotcha.
So I don't know if that was clear or whatever, but I think yeah, I'm done. So
yeah, I think that answered my question. I was trying to throw in so I guess they're irrelevant disanalogies. Then you would say, obviously, because you're just trying to say that there can be this instrumental way in which someone can be a source while somebody else is a source. And you could come up with another analogy that's based in reality type thing to prove that. So that's.
Yeah, I don't want to say that your criticisms weren't relevant, but because they were pertinent for this discussion, and I think a lot of people do think like Dale, and a lot of people in my circles have said exactly what Josh has said, although Josh says it probably better than most of those people, to be
Well,
honest.
thank you.
But generally, yes, your criticisms are definitely relevant to the debate. But I think if the theological determinist is going to get anywhere in the debate, they have to hone in the dialectical context in which they're using these analogies. And I think it's obvious, but maybe you guys would disagree. I've thought about it a lot, so I want to try to hone in as much as possible the analogies I use for very specific purposes, and not just broad brushing them so that they're open to criticisms.
Right.
Gotcha. All right.
So the analogy is not necessarily to establish anything like agency or moral responsibility. You're talking about phases of causality that allow for
Right.
separation between an ultimate source and an immediate or instrumental source. Like this would be
Right,
relevant
exactly.
to a distinction like finger on trigger to the hammer in the pistol, the explosion of the gunpowder, and then the movement of the bullet, the impact of the bullet, the bleeding out, right? So those are all different, let's say, sources of the demise of somebody who is shot. Bleeding out is more of an immediate source than the pulling of the trigger, right? So you're getting closer and closer to the actual event. You're not saying that bleeding out is a separate agent with its own causality. You're saying that that's where it's nested in the causal chain, right?
Right. Yeah, I love this guy. You guys should have him host a lot more, if not
We
already.
try.
Yeah, Josh, it's perfect. I think you articulate it really, really well, and so you're not just.
I am genuinely trying to pay
hearing me.
attention. I am not
Right.
trying to like frame you in any kind of way.
No,
I'm
no, no.
really trying to get it.
I love that. And my wife always reminds me, and she's right, but there is a difference between hearing and listening. And you are listening, so thank you. But yeah, that's exactly what I would say, right? I'm not saying, because there's more work that has to be done. Like, even if you grant that Harry Potter's the source, is he responsible? So what? And is the missile responsible? Is the lightning responsible? There's obviously more work that needs to be done, and that's Fish and Revisa's view. That's what they're trying to do. But this little small piece, at least grant the fact, I think it's intuitive that we should grant the fact that there's some sources that are compatible with determinism. And so, yeah, Josh, what you said is, I would take it to be true. Yeah.
Right on.
So then I would say it would be a good idea to jump back then to Tyler's initial question, which is about the subjectivity of viewing yourself as either a source or the source. And the Preciado's language was viewing a child, not a full-grown adult with like developed logical skills or anything like that, but just down to the intuitive level of viewing yourself as a source or the source. The difference between the sources you're talking about is an instrumental source doesn't have to be an agent, but
Right.
a morally responsible agent does have to be a source that is sufficiently responsible, right? And so a child being sufficiently responsible morally would have to be more than just an instrumental source, unless I'm misunderstanding still.
No, so what Fish and Revisa says, all that's necessary for sourcedness is not the ultimate source, like the sufficient source. What's necessary is just you to be the instrumental source. That's it. So even in Frankfurt style examples, Jones is clearly, at least to my estimation, not the sufficient source of his actions. Now, some theologians, like I think Scott Christensen, wants to try to dispute that. And he wants to say that there's like a dual source, like two sufficient sources. W. Matthews Grant actually, coming from the Thomistic perspective, want to say something similar to that. I'm on the fence of whether or not there can be two sufficient sources. I think it's just much easier to say God is the one and only sufficient source. Mm-hmm. And then if I'm a source at all, which I'm going to say I am an instrumental source. And I think that is sufficient. Now, Preciado is responding or explicating Fish and Revisa's theory. And now they are causal. They believe in the possibility, not the actuality, but the possibility of causal determinism. And if that's the case, how can we view people as morally responsible if causal determinism is true? And they take it to be the moral upbringing of the child because they're coming from a non-theistic background. So that's why they're using this idea of moral education of kids. and then Preciado is just responding to that idea of explicating their views of how we take kids generally to be morally responsible.
So then you would agree then if the child views themselves as the source, they're just misapprehending their place in the causal chain.
Yeah. Yes. If something like Calvinistic determinism is true, or if causal determinism is true, the way Fish and Revisa try to argue it, then yeah, I don't like the definite article. To me, I don't like how Preciado used the. I think they should have said a, or he should have said a, because I don't even know if Fish and Revisa say the. They probably do, but if that's the case, well then yeah, I think to be consistent, especially if we want to bring their theory to an actual theological deterministic universe, then I think we should say an indefinite article a. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that help?
It does, and I think that more directly answers the question that Tyler had asked initially, which was about his concern was about the subjectivity of seeing oneself as the source, and that being the guiding intuition for a child being brought up in a moral circumstance to see themselves as the source of their actions. Like I have kids, you have a kid, your kid's still kind of young for this kind of instruction, but when they get to a point where they're actively doing things and making decisions that they know better, and then you tell them, you know better, why did you do this thing? There's a strong implication for the kid that they are in fact the source of that decision causally, they themselves solely and alone, and you treat them as though that were the case. And so it's easy for them to gain that as the intuition without it having to be articulated in this way. And so I think I understand what you mean by say like generalizing out from there, not the source, but an immediate source of the event rather than the actual, did you say sufficient source?
Yeah.
Okay. So the sufficient source would be like the beginning of the causal chain. Okay, I understand then. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, I think when we say the, I think if Fish and Revisa, because they're writing it in a time where sourcehood really just meant one thing, and so they're just meaning source, right? And Bob Kane's book, The Significance of Free Will, in which he actually argues for this idea of ultimate sourcehood, was fairly new at the time. It was published in 1996, so that was 2 years old. They were finishing writing their book, and so that's why their language is really ambiguous. And and I like what Preciado actually says here, that nor do they mean that nothing is like, he actually explicitly says like they do not mean that he is the ultimate source, right? So maybe we could say, I am the immediate causal source. So maybe if you put in parentheses the immediate or approximate or, the formal, then I would be okay with the definite article. So
I feel like instrumental is the right word. I really do. I feel like instrumental is the right word.
Instrumental. Perfect. Yeah. So the instrumental causal source. Well, then I would say, yeah, Jones is the instrumental causal source. The lightning bolt is the instrumental causal source. Now, I am not the sufficient causal source, right? And so the intuition that I think the incompatibilists and the compatibilists are now at odds are with, like, okay, which one, sufficient or instrumental, is really necessary for responsibility? Libertarians like Bob Kane will say, well, efficient causal source, or rather the sufficient causal source, and then actual sequence compatibilists like Fish and Revisa will say, no, just the instrumental. It's just a shame to me, because it was published in 98, that kind of philosophy wasn't really big on the market at the time. So now, hopefully, because of Preciado's work, we can start seeing the shift of different kinds of sourcehood at play here, because they really do mean different things. And I think we ought to stand back and tell the audience who aren't steeped in the literature and in this debate that yes, they do mean different things. So I think Preciado starts to do that.
I think it's great that you bring that distinction out for our audience, and if you're listening, since you're listening to this, and just by the way, thank you for the people who are still with us. I know we've been going for an hour and 30, and I'm assuming these are people that have watched previous episodes, because if not, and this was my first one, I would be lost, guys. I'm not even playing. But since we've had these conversations before and taken the time, I mean, guys, we've been at this for like months now, since Colton and you and I first started talking. And I love it. So I really appreciate you guys really clarifying things and explaining the things that you have in the way that you do, right? That just means a whole lot for me. And so thank you for that. I want to ask you, Colton, and I don't have this wrote down. It just kind of came to mind. And Colton, you are Stratton's how do you phrase it? Your biggest fan.
Yeah, I'm his biggest fan.
That's right. And Josh, you can maybe correct me if I'm wrong here too. But I'm just here, and given the conversations that Dr. Stratton and I have had, I think he would say at this point, yeah, but if you're defining the agent like that, all you're doing, Colton, is defining him as a caused cause, right? And Josh, would that be fair to say? Okay. So my question, Colton, is whenever you hear that, or it doesn't even have to be Dr. Stratton, but even another non-Calvinist would say something to that effect, right? What is the objection you actually hear there, and what would your response be to it?
The caused cause?
Yeah.
I don't know if I would necessarily have a rejoinder to it. I don't like the implication that it's a chain. So I think it's more, and this does kind of sort of get into the author analogy, I think it's more of a God determines my determining of some action or some choice. So if I'm going to use causal language, but this does not mean I endorse causal language, it's just easier to use. Okay, so for the record, God would cause, like if determinism is true, then it would say God causes my causing of something. So to say that, I am a caused cause is a little bit more passive and a little bit more Edwardian, of more of like the domino theory, a domino model of providence underneath
Dominoes, Dale. Dominoes.
Yeah, there you go.
And I think for many, many reasons, and Peter Furlong, who is agnostic about the issue of incompatibilism and compatibilism, but he leans on the indeterministic side. He wrote an excellent book, The Challenges of Divine Determinism. This book right here, I actually have it with me. Very expensive book. He distinguishes that model, the domino model, the Edwardian model, with the author analogy model. So, which he calls the author analogy model, he calls primary divine determinism. And he actually does think that the primary divine deterministic model is probably the best one for a determinist to use, and not the Edwardian model. So like the caused cause, because the author analogy, or what he calls the primary divine deterministic model, allows for active agency in the model if it works. Whereas the Edwardian model or the domino model is a little bit close to passivity. And I'm using those words specifically for my biggest fan, Dr. Stratton. So, because he uses activity.
Yeah, he's your biggest fan now. That's good stuff.
If he doesn't say that, he should, because, but I think I'm using that language just to hone in on the fact that one model, I am inclined to say that, yes, it does render, I think, the agent to be passive. Okay. But the other model, on the other hand, something in which Dr. Stratton doesn't actually touch, the authorial model or primary divine model is what Furlong calls it. That model, I'm inclined to say it does allow for some active agency. So it's not the same thing as cause. Now, that's my first thought. But let's just say none of that mattered at all, and you just thought to mean causes, and it just traces back to something that is the sufficient cause. And if that's what the objection is trying to get at, then my rejoinder would be, yeah, that's what determinism is. It traces back to a sufficient cause. Congratulations, you just gave me a definition.
Right.
So then the person who's with that objection would have to go further than a mere definition to show why that is problematic. And of course, there's arguments for that, and
Sure.
we've talked about those arguments, but that would be my two-part rejoinder to that objection.
Okay, fair enough. David, is there anything that you would like to add? I know you just kind of came in late. No, shaking your head. He
Nope.
runs
Yeah.
away.
No, I was trying to hit
Yeah,
the mute button,
David.
but hit the stop cam button there.
Yeah.
No, man, like I said, I caught the tail end of that question, but as Colt was describing that question just before, I picked up exactly what Josh picked up on too. So I think that it was explained well. So even though I only caught like part of it. So
Okay. All right, let's move on then. So I'm trying to pick which one I want to go to. I'm going to skip the next one that's kind of chronologically in place. And
I think Colton really liked 13 the best.
I did really
well,
like 13.
How does it start? Because whenever I deleted the other questions, it moved my numbering up.
Right.
And so now I'm like 1, 2, 3, 4.
It said, can you help me unpack what Preciado is getting at here?
Gotcha. Okay. So Preciado, this is his quote, or this is what he writes in the book. Quote, as a privation, evil is not a positive substance and thus does not need an efficient cause. Since it does not need an efficient cause, God could not possibly be the efficient cause. So my first question in this, and Colton, would you rather me read the entire thing and list my questions, or kind of go through it as I've got it broken up here, ask the question and then you answer it and then just move on kind of like that?
I'd rather do it by question, like chunked. I think it would be better for the audience too.
Okay.
So.
Same. Okay. So my first question, and since evil does not need an efficient cause, why are we then held responsible for evil?
Right. So this is actually a really, the debate has shifted from Augustine, because he was the one who kind of thought about this idea of evil being like a privation or something like that,
Mhm.
And so it kind of shifted from him all the way back in the Middle Ages, and it shifted throughout the centuries, and it really hasn't, like most reformers, most traditional reformers have picked up on this question and have been like, oh yeah, like it's obvious, but it hasn't really gotten a lot of good attention, which is exactly why I think Preciado has responded to it and has actually written about it.
Yeah.
And so all that to say is, it depends on the question. It depends on how you press the question. So yes, evil does not need an efficient cause, according to Preciado, according to most reformers, according to Augustine, I would say even, and I would agree with that too. Then why are we then responsible for evil? Because I think the easiest solution, although the solution, like I said, the history has changed the solutions and people have changed it, is really we're held responsible for evil because we are or could be an efficient cause of evil. So I think that just because you're the efficient cause doesn't mean so it depends. And so I'm going to say half. I don't know why we are responsible for evil in that sense, but it depends on how the relationships between efficient and sufficient causes are done. So if you want to say, if I'm just kind of like thinking out loud, but if you say that the efficient cause entails the sufficient cause, well, then that means if I'm the efficient cause of sin or evil, I am the sufficient cause of sin or evil. Well,
Right.
Given theological determinism, I don't think you can say that, right?
Unless
Because
there's two
God would
sufficient causes.
unless you say right, and so unless you actually say that there are two sufficient causes. So that's why I say the debate has changed, and
Sure.
I kind of understand the debate, but people say different things and they want to argue something different. So every single time, which is what makes this question so unique and hard. But I like to say that there's only one sufficient cause, so I wouldn't necessarily be able to answer it in that way. I would rather say that being the sufficient cause entails that you're the efficient cause, but then again, I don't really want to say that either, because then if God is the sufficient cause of all things, then he is the efficient cause of evil, and I don't want to say that, right?
Right.
So it's like, and they, so it's a really hard question. I think that other people have probably said it better than me. Like Peter Furlong in the same book that I've said, he gives a couple reasons. He first gives out a robust model of privation. So how can a theological determinist hold to responsibility in a robust model of privation? He effectively, I think, argues against that robust model. And then he goes into a more modest model. Unfortunately, I cannot recall the details of such a model right now, but maybe at a different time, a different episode, if you want to just specifically talk about evil or whatever, then perhaps. But yeah, the question, I'm not going to be, I'm going to know my limits, and I'm going to be humble in my limits. I'm not entirely sure. So.
And that's another reason we love you, Colton. So, all right. So is there anything, Josh, David, or Dill, before I move on to the second, like part 2, I guess, of that question, that you guys would like to add before I do that? You guys good to go, all of you? Okay. All right. And Colton, if it's the same thing, given like that this is already written out, right? And you know, it happens to be you don't know, fair enough. So Preciado goes on then, quote, though God does not efficiently cause evil, he does permit it by permissive decree and govern it by providence. Excuse me. So my question is, wouldn't the language of permission entail God is permitting an action of which someone or something else is the source? So the efficient and sufficient source of that action.
Right. I do know the answer to this one.
Okay, cool.
So I like what Preciado is using mildly different language than I would use. So he's using permissive decree. I would rather use a passive decree or a deficient decree, not an efficient decree. And I think we do mean the exact same thing here, because he uses other reformers that would say deficient means. He just hasn't quoted it here. But I think Bignon has a great article, essay in Calvinism and Middle Knowledge book. I think it was published in 2019, but Calvinism and Middle Knowledge. That book, fantastic essay. The essay is called, that Bignon contributes to it, Lord Willing and God Forbid, basically defending divine permission language in a theological deterministic framework. Mm-hmm. Fantastic book, well, it is a fantastic book, but fantastic article. Now, the essay is modified from his actual book, Excusing Sinners and Blaming God, like the very last chapter. But basically, he argues that you can have this sort of passive determination and active determination, and it's clearly seen in a couple of models. Now, he uses what he calls a bobsled. And so the bobsled, if you're not familiar with how the bobsled functions, if you pull the brakes, then you slow down. But if you don't do anything, you kind of speed up. And so, and kind of just based on that, he's using that kind of bobsled analogy to show this intuition, or this, to argue for this intuition that things can be determined in 2 different ways. So either through passiveness or activeness. So then he says, well, what does permission actually mean? On its bare definition, what does it mean? He tries to argue that it just means passivity, that it's just passive allowance. And so I think when we determinists often use this idea of allowing something to be the case, we do want to say that, well, how can that be the case? Because God determines everything. Right. But if he determines everything in different ways, specifically if he determines something in a passive way, in which he just refrains his grace, so what I call just divine omission, then what that means is, yes, he's refraining his grace through that divine omission. He is passive. But is he still the sufficient determiner of that thing? Mm-hmm. Yes. And then if we go back to what we previously said about sourcehood, then yes, Billy Bob is the immediate or instrumental, as Josh liked that word. So the instrumental source of that action, though he was not the ultimate source of the action. The ultimate source of the action was God via his divine omission.
Right. Right.
So
And
I think that answers the question. But so
it does.
and it depends on, obviously it's controversial, but I think, because I know Stratton and even Date says, and Date is a theological determinist, that no, Calvinist determinists cannot use permission language in their system. I like to kindly disagree,
Mhm.
because I think Bignon's article does it for me. I think it's a good, really well written article, and I think he persuaded me that we can use that. I don't think we can use bare allowance or bare permission like the libertarian does, or
Right.
the open theist specifically, but we can use a kind of permission in our language. Yes.
I think
That
this
makes
comes
sense.
back to the same thing that we were talking about in the last episode about making proper nuances or caveats before using language, so that it doesn't feel like a theft of vocabulary kind of scenario.
Right.
I was having a
Right.
discussion recently in a group in which your name actually came up because somebody had said, "Oh, I learned from Colton that as a determinist I can use permission language," and I don't think that he understood necessarily exactly that distinction that you're making right now. Is
Was
that
it Shemes?
I think it was actually, now that you
He's
mentioned it.
my podcast host, so my
Okay,
own
yeah, so then
personal podcast.
it might have been, but
Nice.
it was one of those times where I was like, I don't think this conversation is going to go anywhere, so I kind of bowed out. But it was one of those glaring examples of a lack of nuance that led to something like a misapprehension of what was actually being said or actually
Right.
being expressed or whatever. And that's why I was kind of like, I don't know that I don't think that it would be something that your view would afford to use that language as plainly as you're using it.
Right.
And so I think that this probably falls under that same category of permission or allowance or passivity would be something that requires that further nuance like we're providing here. I'm really enjoying this right now.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I go ahead. Sorry, Colton.
I was just going to say, I did look at your playlist that you guys had for theological determinism. You had 2 videos on permission language with J.D. Martin and one with Leighton Flowers, right?
Yep.
Yeah, those were some of the first that we did on this topic specifically with,
Right.
Other than just Tyler and I, schmoozing and talking with each other. We actually had JD come on, and though he talks as fast as a rapper, he does have a lot to say. And so that I feel like those conversations were really productive.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Tyler, but
No, that's fine. I think it would be a hard conversation to follow if JD and Date got together and was debating each other. That would be you'd have to slow that one down instead of speeding it up to like 1.5. Like slow it down to 0.5, and then we could get it all in. But no, I love the nuance, and Josh, I'm glad you brought that up, because here's the thing, guys. I've even heard non-Calvinists say and argue, like against the bobsled analogy, that God's actively doing this. He's determining to actively pump the brakes or actively let it slide. And given the nuance that you just brought to the table, Colton, is that if God determines in different ways, such as passively or even actively by withholding or causing in a very real sense, then that analogy, or I'm sorry, the objection to that analogy kind of falls flat and can even be construed as a straw man, given if you don't hold to God only actively decreeing everything in the world to happen, that if you allow room for that passivity, right? Is that fair to say?
Right. I like to go back to this ongoing analogy with the chess.
Yeah.
But we win by chess by either actively moving our pieces or passively not moving others. So what makes a good grandmaster, a good chess player, is knowing which piece to move and which one not to move.
Right.
When a given situation or given event requires it. And does that mean that they're not the sufficient checkmater when they win? No. Or they're not the sufficient player when they win. So obviously, I'm pressing a one relevant similarity. There are relevant differences between God's determination and the chess, of course, right? We're not mechanistic or anything like that, like a chessboard. But the idea is that I think that when we understand that God can refrain his grace from a situation, then ontologically, sin would naturally creep through, being the privation, because sin is just the privation or absence of good. Really, that's what it really is. Evil is the absence of good. Wherever there's not good in a situation, then evil will be there. So when God refrains his goodness or grace in a situation, then sin will come through. Heath White describes it as Swiss cheese. So like the cheese is God's goodness and the holes are a bunch of evil. And he's like, I know it's kind of tongue in cheek, but I think it does justice. And I'm like, well, okay. So like, but that's how Heath White describes it in Calvinism.
I like that.
Josh is losing his mind over there.
I love
That's
Swiss
not-
cheese. And I thought it was great.
Evil is Swiss cheese.
I will say that's the first time I've ever heard Swiss cheese used as an analogy, like for what God does.
I'll never eat a turkey sandwich the same. Thanks for that.
You're always thinking about God's privation and passive decree. But yeah, it's to me, I think once we understand the differences between divine decrees and that the determinists ought not be committed to just one active decree, which is what a lot of incompatibilists, indeterminists want to say, then yeah, what you're right. I think the objection sort of falls apart here. I think they should do better, and I think some have. Like Furlong has done better, and other people have done better. But it all has to do with the definitions and the debate, and so like what you guys are doing here.
Absolutely. And I think, I'm looking at these questions, and I think given that nuance, given the fact that it's not all just active, I really honestly think it answers my next couple of questions I had for that. For like I said, that was for our audience that don't see our notes, right? I had this one question broken up into, I think it was like 6 different questions. And given the nuance that Colton just brought to the table, I think those questions are answered. And yes, Titan, we are almost at 1,000 subs. So if there are any of our listeners that have not subscribed to the channel, please feel free and consider doing that. That not only helps us out and reach that 1,000 subscriber milestone, but it works well with the YouTube algorithms. And so the more subs you get, the more thumbs up you get, the more likes, the more comments, the more YouTube pushes our videos out to people that wouldn't normally see them. And so any little action that our listeners do, it really helps get our content out there for people to hear. Dale or David, is there anything before we move on? Is there anything that you guys would like to add?
Yeah, I just had a question about the Swiss cheese analogy because so that's interesting. So like you're kind of saying when God withdraws, he's the cheese kind of thing. There's just evil in that gap, that hole kind of thing.
Right.
But like is there anything like how does that deal with degrees? Because obviously even unregenerate people, it's not a total hole. They can do good things and do moral things or
Right.
some believe in God, even if they're not full Christians and saved. So like, how would that fit into the Swiss cheese analogy? I don't know.
Are you saying, just for clarification, are you saying is the unregenerate person, how does God determine the unregenerate person's sinfulness when they aren't really that, like, they still do good things? Is that what you're saying? I'm sorry.
Yeah, because it's not like a total God's, the analogy is trying to say God's refraining from giving his grace kind of thing for these people. So all that's left is evil in that vacuum. But like I'm saying, but in point of fact, it's not that they're just in a hole. They're not total evil. They do have
Right. Oh, okay.
They can do some good, you know what I mean? So like how do you explain that if they're not doing it through God?
Right. It's gonna sound kind of mechanistic, but just kind of bear with me. In my mind, I make sense of it through like percentages. So like some people have God's because we do pray for like, God, give me grace, give me more grace. I mean, that is found all throughout scripture, and we individually pray it. It is a common prayer. And to me, when I hear something like that, I hear it like, okay, you have God's grace in some sense, especially if you're a believer, but you want You need more to live the Christ-like life. Well, I would be a Calvinist who would say that unbelievers do have a common grace. And part of that common grace is something that you are not as evil as you need to be or as you are. So the basic distinction between total inability or total depravity. So yes, you're totally depraved, but you're not so much depraved that you will do all these heinous sins when given a chance because of God's common grace with that individual. So God may have, let's just say, I'm going to use bizarre and maybe even striking examples, but for instance, let's say some of my students who are arguably unsaved, well, some of them just straight up tell me they hate God. So I guess I can deduce that they are not saved. But let's just say for that student, they're great students and they're fantastic and they're seniors. They have a lot of life going for them. God may have a significant amount, even though they're unregenerate, they may have a significant amount of God's common grace given to them. Let's say an arbitrary number like 20% or something like that. I don't know, 20% of God's grace. Whereas maybe Paul writing the books of the Bible, maybe he had more because it was divinely inspired. So maybe 70%. I don't know, but you see how it kind of percentage. Maybe you and I, the average person, the average Christian, maybe like 50%, or maybe we don't want to be that close to Paul, so maybe 40%. Okay, but could a Christian even have less than an unregenerate person? Yeah, sometimes if they're like really struggling with sin or something, maybe 19%. So maybe my student, even though she hates God and unregenerate, she has just a better human being, all things considered, than me. Jeffrey Dahmer, maybe on the other hand, has like 10% of God's grace.
Yeah.
So he's alive and he's breathing. And he had a grandma who actually was really, really close to the Lord. Maybe that was part of the 10%, but then slowly decreasing based on Romans 1 principles. He starts to refrain from his hand and giving them up to their own desires. And so maybe 9%, 8%, and that's when the evil started to just bust out the seams. Is this right? Is this the correct model, how we should see it? Not sure. Maybe. I think it makes sense to me, and I think it should make sense to other people, but that's how I would describe it.
Yeah, that's how I would work it as well, kind of thing. But
it's apparent that Dale's never eaten Swiss cheese because there's degrees and percentages of holes in the cheese, and some are smaller, and then there's some that are just like thinner. And no,
I was thinking of like, they're filled in with like a thin layer of cheese or something. And there's different thicknesses. I don't know.
I just wonder, Colton, does this work on other definitions of evil, right? Because you described it as a vacuum, but I think the Bible gives us almost a plethora of definitions of sin in a maybe passive way, so we get like the violation of purpose, versus just the absence of good. Augustine taught that it was a you lose your form type of thing. That's what evil is, a loss of form. Right. So I'm wondering if that does work with other definitions of evil. I can see that it might, but I'm not sure. So
yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't really studied other definitions of evil because to me, I'm just thoroughly convinced and biased that the privation theory of evil is the best. I think it's most historically rooted doctrine. I would agree with everything that Augustine says on the matter, even Aquinas, because it has a long tradition in the Christian doctrine. And so I'm just like, I don't see how evil could be anything else personally. But the thing is, if that's the case, it seems a whole lot like compatible with determinism if it's done right. So yeah, I'm not sure. David, maybe I'll have to study it. Question for another time, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Right on, guys. Right on. Okay, so while talking to Josh in the private chat, his woman wants control back of the kitchen.
Woman.
Yo, woman. And my wife has given me that look. And so
that's a Swiss cheese sandwich, huh?
Yeah. Dale, just eat your cheese out of a bag, okay?
Pre-cheese, it's still milk, yo.
There you go. So
right.
I want to do one last question, Colton, and then David and Dell, if you guys and Colton, if you guys want to continue, by all means. I think Josh and I are going to bow out though. If you guys don't want to and want to end it, then I can close this out. Whatever y'all want to do, just message me in the private chat, and we can do it like that. But Colton, I'm going to stem down to my last question, and I'm going to stop at the first because I'm still a little confused by this. But I'm going to stop at the first question mark and not read the remaining because you've already answered those questions. And so I thank you for that. And that nuance, man, I'm telling you right now, if anybody takes one thing out of this episode, let it be the nuance between God actively and passively decreeing things. I think that's been the thing for me anyway that has stood out amongst this whole episode. And that's the thing that's brought the most clarification to me anyway, whenever it comes to theological determinism in general. And so I am exceptionally proud of this episode because of that. And Colton, if you have brought that to my attention in a previous episode, bro, I'm sorry I didn't get it until right now. So for that, thank you. And
That's
I will
progress, man. That's what we're aiming at.
That's right. That's right. We don't get everything in one video. And so I learn progressively, which I think I was created to do, right? And so with that being said, so let me quote the Westminster, and then I'm going to quote Preciado, and then I'll ask you this question, Colton. So quoting the WCF, the almighty power, unsearchable wisdom, and infinite goodness of God so far manifest themselves in his providence that it extendeth itself even to the first fall and all other sins of angels and men, and that not by bare permission, but such as hath joined with it a most wise and powerful bounding, and otherwise ordering and governing of them in a manifold dispensation to his holy ends, yet so as the sinfulness thereof proceedeth only from the creature and not from God, who, being most holy and righteous, neither is nor can be the author or approver of sin. Preciado then writes, quote, Article 4 makes clear that God even decreed the first fall in human sins. They are actualized under his providence. From these statements of the Confession and Catechism, it seems clear that all human actions, good or evil, have their origin in God's decree and providence. Therefore, the Confession excluded the sourcehood aspect of libertarian Calvinism. My question is, how is the Confession excluding the sourcehood condition when it specifically states that the sinfulness thereof proceedeth only from the creature and not from God?
Right. So what Preciado, again, should probably have been a little bit more specific here.
Okay.
With Oliver Crisp's libertarian Calvinism, he has in mind the ultimate sourcehood aspect. So not an instrumental source aspect. Now, I love, as kind of an aside, but I love that the Westminster also says not by bare permission. And I believe that you can still have some sort of permission through a passive decree, but it's not a bare permission. But alongside of that, it, like you said, it allows it excludes a source condition in the sense that it excludes the ultimate source condition. So when it says, the sinfulness therefore proceeded only from the creature and not from God, that is I take it to mean the instrumental source. So the instrumental sinfulness that was proceeded from the creature and not from God. Now, it's kind of hard because the Westminster is not as clear as it could be.
Sure.
Because I think Preciado does also write that God can be the material determiner of sin, namely that God can just make the material aspects, like the event surrounding the sin, actually occur. Mm-hmm. Not that he makes the sin itself occur, but the materials around the sin occur. And I'm inclined to agree. But the Westminster, I still think that's compatible with the Westminster in the case that it's just not as clear and not as nuanced and specific as it could be. Mm-hmm. So all that to say is the Westminster does exclude an ultimate source condition, which Preciado was originally trying to argue that it does exclude it so that he can show libertarian Calvinism to be false.
Right.
Oliver Crisp's Calvinism to be false. And he also tries to show that at the same time, God is not the efficient determiner of sin, but in that sense, it's not from God. But, and I think he goes on, if I remember correctly in the book, he goes on a little bit later and says, okay, in what sense is it from God though? And then that's when he kind of distinguishes between the material cause and the instrumental cause and the ultimate cause, and how does God's determination relate to all those different kinds of causes. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It does, but you said something that I have a question on. So
Sure.
you had said that and I forget exactly how you worded it, but you were talking about the material. God doesn't cause the sinfulness, right? But he,
Right.
like I said, I forget how you word it, but he makes the material, I guess, around the sin, kind of come to be, right? Is that close?
Right.
Okay.
So he basically he doesn't determine the essence of sin, because that is, you can't determine the essence of sin. Sin is a privation. It's an absence. It's the hole in the Swiss cheese.
Sure.
Right? Swiss cheese doesn't determine the holes. The holes just kind of prop up. They're just an absence, privation. But he does determine the material, the cheese.
Okay.
He does determine the actual material or the events that come from that thing, the relationship between us, the circumstances, and the sin itself.
So given that he determines the material, would you say that he determines that actively or passively?
Honestly, I haven't really thought about it.
Okay.
I guess it would depend on the theory of moral responsibility. Like if you determine a specific circumstance, is it specifically if it's a sinful circumstance, would that entail that someone is morally culpable? I'm inclined to say no, because I think so I think God can determine the material efficiently, but I want to kind of pause here and be like, it's kind of weird to kind of put both causes, material cause and an efficient cause, together and have them entail one another, because that's not Aristotle's original point. Like, I think they're separate. And so I kind of want to separate them. But to answer your question, even if we put them together, I'm not sure it would still entail God's culpability, even if we said God efficiently caused the material cause.
Gotcha.
Only because I think that the moral responsibility is found in the formal causality of a thing, or the instrumental causality of the thing, instead of primarily the efficient causality of the thing.
Right. Kind of like in Harry Potter's world, Harry would be held responsible, whereas J.K. Rowling wouldn't be. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Right on. Josh, I know you got to go.
Two things.
Yep.
Two things. First thing, I'm going to go Frank Turek style. Another analogy that works for the privation theory of evil would be rust on a car. If you have a car and it begins to rust, it is the privation of the metal, or the deterioration of the metal, the absence of its good quality, that creates the deterioration of the metal into rust. No car, no rust. So I think that kind of covers your analogy here in perhaps a more clear, easier to understand than cheese and holes. The other thing is, I really have to go, and I love you guys, and this was a fantastic episode, and I will be listening to this like 60 times tomorrow.
No lie.
But I have, that was my lovely wife. It was reminding me her presence is imminent doom. So I love you guys, and I'm gonna hop off of here. Fantastic.
Tell you what, she's been the star of the show with their background stuff.
Antics,
yeah, I know some of the calamity. It's okay. It's all right. It was determined. I love you guys. I got to get off of here, but this has been a fantastic show. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you for your time and attention. This has been fantastic, but I got to hop off. Love you guys.
Love you, brother. See ya. David, Dale, anything you guys want to add before we wrap?
Yeah, not really. No,
good.
It's been a good show, as Josh has said. We covered a lot of the book and stuff like that, which I know we haven't covered in previous shows. So that is a new aspect for the audience. Obviously, for people like me who've never even read the book and stuff like that, so it was good to kind of what are the main elements and stuff like that. To I'm assuming Colton represented him properly, but and gave his own take on that stuff. So yeah, it was good.
Right on. Right on. Okay.
Yeah, I think it was good. Yeah. From what I caught, I know I came in late, so
Yeah. Yeah. Check it out, David, since you didn't get all of it.
Yeah.
Check it out sometime soon and then let me know. But Colton, let me just ask you, brother, since you've kind of been on the hot seat, so to say, tonight, is there anything that you would like to bring to the table and just address with any non-Calvinist that's listening right now that interacts in these debates? What would you say to our non-Calvinist friends that do that?
I'm not sure. Like what I would like to talk about, or what convinces me, like why I'm not an incompatibilist or something like that.
Anything from the scale of what you would like to see more so from our non-Calvinist friends whenever they bring up this discussion with Calvinists, something that maybe they're doing wrong that you see a lot of, or just anything.
Right. I think most, not all, but most don't detail the relevant literature enough. I
Okay.
think that's the biggest. That's a nice way of saying that I don't think most have done their homework, and so it's when I've gotten in this debate years and years ago, I learned very, very quickly that determinism is not the majority view. It's just not,
Yeah.
and it has been almost like blasphemed either directly or indirectly in layman circles and theological forums and in the actual scholarly literature. And to me, I don't understand why, because honestly, there's more and more works being published specifically regarding theological determinism now than there ever were. I mean, honestly, in the last couple of years, this book, Theological Determinism, New Perspectives, again, really expensive. And then I already told you this one, The Challenges of Divine Determinism, both by Furlong, and then the other one was by Furlong and Weissens, I think you pronounce her name. But what's the point? The point is there is good literature out there, people who have thought about these things that the layman has already thought about and maybe used to attack the other side. But I am just a big believer on the case that we should use professional arguments to get our point across as much as possible. Yes, we can kind of battle each other here and there, but I think the professionals kind of are really the person trying to get the other people out of the cave. Like they're the freed prisoner out of the Plato's cave. And they're like, hey, we've already made this journey. Come follow us. And I think it's to our doom to say, no, I don't want to follow you. So I do set aside a pretty hefty personal fund. My wife is so gracious to do that, to buy some of these expensive works, because I really do want to be informed about the homework. So with regards to, the incompatibilists or the non-Calvinists, I think what I see a lot of is they're not as informed in the relevant debates like they should, and that just saddens me. And it's just the same conversations over and over again. Like, oh, you can't be the source of determinism is true. You can't. There's no permission language given determinism, or there's no moral response. If I determine you and force you to do what you do, then you can't. Because what's happening there in those debates is, okay, force is synonymous with determinism, but that's not necessarily the case. But you're assuming that. You're assuming the consequence argument that I couldn't do otherwise. You're doing all these types of things, but the professionals have already waded the waters. And so if we just read more, if we just studied just a little bit more in the professional literature, then perhaps, even if we're not convinced, let's say, of Calvinism or theological determinism, then I think we would do a lot better justice, at least not talking past each other.
Absolutely.
So I think that's like the number one thing I would say, what I see and what frustrates me the most.
That's good. That's good. I really like that. Do your homework and, get on. I mean, the work's already been done, like you said, and why would we not only learn from that, But if we are deep into this conversation, Colton, like you are, right, add to what's been done already. Like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. You know what I mean? And so I agree wholeheartedly. I haven't got as many books as you, and I'm kind of saddened by that. But I did get Tempe's Sourcehead book. And actually, Colton, you recommended it to me. And I was just so not only baffled by the way Tempe breaks these things down. I was a little confused on the last chapter, but hey, that's to be expected, right? But the way he broke these things down made it to where somebody that I think you have to have the basic definitions, even though Tempe does do a great job laying those definitions out in the book in the first few chapters there. But I think he does a really good job. And if all of the philosophers' books that Colton that you've mentioned is anything like Tempe's, even if they disagree with him in the long run, I think it makes it easy. And Tempe did a really good job making it easy for the layman to really follow along and give the history, give the arguments. I mean, I've heard some non-Calvinists and even some Calvinists are determinists and indeterminists. Like, they're arguing for the consequence, and sticking on that one argument. And it's like, guys, you don't realize that there's been years of argumentation that has developed, the consequence argument, and you guys are stuck at like the ground floor of it. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, stack up and add to this because it's there, right? And I think that
Right.
Preciado has really done a good job of mining that material and bringing it over and converting it into or for the theologian. And I think that we should all, I mean, if you're really into this conversation, I really think that's something that's lacking now, because like I said, Preciado's book is one of the only ones that I found like that. And so I think it's lacking. And so it would do good for theologians that are into this conversation, mine those materials and bring them over to whatever side of the debate you fall on. And let's work to a unification, really. I mean, that's the goal, I think, for all Christians to be unified in their mindset and in their worldview, and try to close any gaps that separate us. We are a separated people. I've really learned that in the past few months, really. And I think that anything would be good, even if we disagree in the end, to unify, kind of like Colton, you and I, and the rest of the guys have done tonight. And so if we disagree in the end, we can have good clarifying conversations that bring the ball forward in this game that we're all, a part of. And so I love it, brother. I love you. Thank you for coming back on to do this episode. Like I said, this might be, I know this isn't the last episode because we still got an episode with Dr. Stratton to do. But this might be after that. We might not touch the subject for a while. Like I said, there's some canon issues that I definitely want to get into. David and I, in March, we're setting aside that entire month to work on our gospel documentary. If you don't know, you know now that we are taking donations for that documentary. So if you would like to donate, the plan is to take the money that we get and put it toward advertisement. So every penny we make off donations, once we get this documentary done and finished, take that money and use it toward advertising to get it to as many people as possible. That's the goal. Yeah, Dale.
I just wanted to ask, like, what's the grand finale with Tim Stratton? Are we like responding to this video, or is it like a independent thing? Like, what are we doing with Tim?
Not necessarily. And so I think, given the conversations that we've had with Tim in the past, I'm sure there'll be things that he wants to respond to, obviously. But at the same time, I want to focus more on his book than anything. So Mere Molinism. I'm going to get that and give it a quick read through, or well, not a quick read through, but I want to spend some time on that and then bring him on to really question him about his book, right? Not necessarily the episodes we've had with Colton or any past episodes, but mainly toward the book. Yeah. So that's my goal. But other than that, if there's anything that you guys want to bring, like David or Dale, to that conversation,
yeah, like I kind of emailed you. Like I would really like to probe his argument. Like Colton and Tyler Vela, I see him in the comments and stuff. They've always criticized him, always begging the question and stuff. Okay, so like, what is the warrant for each one of your premises? Like that's always what I wanted to. If we could fit that in, that'd be great.
That'd be good. I think that's I think that's warranted, Dale. So absolutely. All right, guys, let's jump off. David,
Not as bad as Swiss cheese, man. No, I'm just kidding.
David, is there anything you want to add before I sign us out?
No, brothers, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening again. If you have not subscribed to the channel, Colton, I want to give you a quick second. You said you have a podcast. Where can people find that?
So yeah, just on YouTube. It's pretty small. It's really just me and my co-host Shemez Foster. That is his real name, Shemez Foster.
Wow. Nice.
He and I go way back. We're basically like brothers. Grew up in the same church, and he just had this crazy idea. Is like, can we just like talk about random things and just record it? I'm like, okay. So it's called Truth C Squared, and we talk pretty much about the same kind of things that you guys talk about. So,
okay.
Which is really cool. But it's way more casual and way more just personal because we just know each other really well, and it's more of a conversational type thing. Nice. But that's it's on YouTube. So C Squared, Truth C Squared podcast. And then also, like I said, I'm Stratton's biggest fan. So I've obviously written tons about Stratton and why I disagree with his book and his rejoinder to Bignon and pretty much his overall theology. But that can be found on academia.com. Make a free account, Google my name, Colton Carlson, Mere Molinism, and it'll pretty much pop up. And I'm starting volume 3 because I'm not done, even though I have 2 volumes and they're 500 pages. I'm not finished, Dr. Stratton. And I have to do I have to critique his theological arguments. So that will be starting in about March, probably finished by mid this year. So that's the goal. But yeah, so academia and then YouTube is where my podcast is at. Yeah.
Well, definitely send me that 3rd volume whenever you get it published. So I'd love to check that out. And I'll be sure to check out your podcast. We'll link in the description below, and you can find that really easily. But Colton, thank you again, brother, for joining us. I've had a blast talking with you. David, Dale, Josh Davidson, brother. I love whenever we all get together. And just like I said, we have our Friday night fellowships. We have our Saturday night fellowships now. And so this has been really fun and exciting. And again, thank you to our listeners. If you like the content, give us a thumbs up. If you really like the content, make sure you subscribe, click that notification bell, and click all to get notified every time we upload a video or go live. Until next time, we will see you soon. Good night. God bless. And stay like